He cannot manage these stairs anymore, Eric. Just look at the bruising on his hip. The sharp click of Melissa's designer heels against the hardwood floor echoed through the hallway, cutting through the quiet morning. A heavy wave of her floral perfume masked the familiar scent of lemon wax I used on the cabinets, and a dull, throbbing ache bloomed in my left side where I had slipped on the basement steps 8 days ago. I am 69 years old, Melissa, and a retired architect, I said, keeping my voice entirely level. I designed that staircase. I know exactly how to navigate it. My son stepped between us, raising his hands in a practiced gesture of peacemaking. Dad, she is just worried about you. That fall was a warning. A warning. They had used that exact word 4 times since Tuesday. I leaned against the cold granite island, watching my daughter-in-law open the refrigerator door much harder than necessary. She inspected the shelves, pulled out a carton of milk, checked the expiration date, and shoved it back into place. Her attention then snapped to the stack of envelopes resting on the corner counter. You have a lot of mail piling up here, Melissa noted, her manicured fingers hovering over the paper. Are you keeping track of the insurance and the property maintenance bills? Everything is on autopay, I replied. I walked over and placed my hand firmly over the stack before she could sift through it, and I am perfectly capable of opening my own mail. Eric cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at the floor, then at his watch. Right. Well, we need to get to work. We will check on you tomorrow. They walked out the front door, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. I stood alone in the entryway, looking around the house I had designed and built with my late wife, Eleanor. We had spent decades paying off this place, turning it into a mortgage-free home filled with our shared history. Through the archway, I could see the sunroom Eleanor had chosen, the morning light hitting the exact spot where she used to read before she passed away. The throbbing in my hip flared up again. It was a minor injury, and my doctor had already cleared me to resume normal activity, but Eric and Melissa were treating it like a fatal decline. I carried the stack of mail to the kitchen table, sat down in my usual chair, and began sorting through the envelopes. An electric bill, a catalog for gardening supplies, and then a thick, heavy white envelope made of premium cardstock. It was addressed directly to me, Harold Bennett. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a glossy presentation folder. The front cover featured a tranquil photograph of manicured lawns and elderly couples sitting on wooden benches. The gold foil letters across the top read, Oakwood Reserve Senior Care. My hands went perfectly still. I opened the folder. The first page was a welcome letter, thanking me for my interest in their private community. The second page was a formal reservation confirmation. Attached to that was a receipt for a non-refundable deposit. The payer listed on the receipt was Eric Bennett. I set the paper down on the wooden table. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked, a slow and rhythmic sound that suddenly felt overwhelmingly loud. I picked up the next document. It was a tentative room assignment, followed by a scheduled move-in date. 14 days from today. I read the date 3 times to ensure my eyes were not failing me. 2 weeks. They had planned to remove me from my own home in exactly 2 weeks. Underneath the schedule was a checklist of medical and legal requirements. One line was highlighted in yellow. It stated that the facility required the authorized representative to provide an executed durable power of attorney, or the admission would remain contingent on the resident's direct consent. Clipped behind that checklist was a grainy photocopy of a law office cover sheet. Eric's name was printed at the top. Near the bottom edge, someone had written a reminder in blue ink, have Dad sign medical and financial forms together. A cold, metallic taste filled my mouth. I did not yell, and I did not throw the folder across the room. Instead, I carefully aligned the edges of the papers and smoothed out the creases. I took my phone from my pocket, opened the camera, and photographed every single page. The lens clicked quietly, capturing the receipt, the dates, the checklist, and the handwritten note. Once I had digital copies of everything, I walked into Eleanor's old study. Her wooden document box still sat on the bottom shelf of the bookcase, exactly where she had left it. I unlocked the small brass clasp, placed the original nursing home documents inside, and turned the key. I took the empty glossy folder back to the kitchen and slipped it near the bottom of the mail stack, leaving just enough edge visible so anyone looking for it would assume I had tossed it aside unopened. I walked to the kitchen sink and turned on the cold water. I splashed my face, letting the chill shock my system. Eric and Melissa had not merely researched a facility out of caution. They had paid money. They had picked a date. They had prepared legal paperwork to take control of my finances, all while smiling in my kitchen and pretending to care about my bruised hip. My phone vibrated against the granite counter with a harsh, buzzing sound. I dried my hands on a towel and picked it up. A new text message had arrived from Melissa. Eric has a few routine medical papers for you tomorrow. Nothing complicated. I stared at the glowing screen. The trap was set, the timeline was moving, and they truly believed I was too old and too weak to fight back. The doorbell rang exactly at noon the next day, right on schedule. Eric stood on the front porch, holding a thick manila folder tucked firmly under his arm. He stepped inside, shedding his autumn coat, and immediately started asking about my pain medication. He wanted to know if my hip was still bruised, if my doctor had scheduled a follow-up appointment, and if my bank accounts were still set to autopay. The questions came in a rapid, practiced rhythm, sounding more like a corporate audit than a son checking on his father. I answered him calmly, keeping my voice perfectly steady while I poured 2 cups of black coffee. When my son finally slid the folder across the kitchen island, calling the contents standard emergency contacts, I did not reach for a pen. I took a slow sip of my coffee instead. I told him I never sign legal documents without reading them thoroughly first, and I would need to look them over tonight. Eric shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting toward the hallway. He insisted the papers were just a formality for my own protection, trying to push a pen closer to my hand. I just smiled, tapped the top of the folder, and offered him a refill. After Eric went into the living room to check the thermostat, I opened the cover. The pages were dense with heavy legal phrasing, but the bold titles printed at the top of each document were impossible to misunderstand. A durable financial power of attorney, a healthcare directive, and buried right at the back, a document granting broad, unrestricted authority over my real estate. Yellow sticky notes poked out from the margins, pointing exactly to where my signature and a notary stamp were required. None of it was executed yet, meaning the papers held no legal weight without my knowing consent. But the sheer scope of the authority Eric was asking for proved exactly what he intended to do. Melissa arrived 2 hours later with a foil-covered casserole dish, treating the evening like a routine family dinner. We sat down at the dining room table, the exact same table where Eleanor and I had hosted nearly 30 years of Thanksgiving meals. Between bites of baked pasta, my daughter-in-law sighed heavily. She steered the conversation toward the rising cost of living, casually mentioning how their own mortgage rate had adjusted recently. Then her gaze drifted up to the wainscoting and the crystal chandelier, shaking her head in mock sympathy. She said it was a terrible shame to see such a massive house sitting so quiet, adding that a family should not sacrifice their children's future to maintain an empty museum. I kept my expression completely blank, taking another slow bite of dinner, asking absolutely no direct questions. Halfway through dessert, Melissa's cell phone rang. She excused herself to step out onto the back patio, leaving her leather handbag resting open on the sideboard next to a stack of loose printed pages. I stood up from my chair to clear the empty plates. As I walked past her bag, my eyes caught the bold red lettering on the top sheet of paper. It was a printed personal budget spreadsheet, completely exposed in plain view. I did not need to touch the paper to read the bolded lines. 3 credit cards were marked past due. 2 monthly payments for their luxury vehicle were listed as missed. Near the very bottom, a massive line item was flagged as urgent, labeled as a nonrefundable boutique lease deposit due within 3 weeks. The financial pressure they were under was not just uncomfortable, it was a complete collapse. I picked up the stack of dessert plates and walked quietly toward the kitchen. The house was settling into its evening silence, and Eric and Melissa had moved into the adjoining sunroom, speaking in hushed tones. They clearly assumed I had gone upstairs to use the restroom. I stopped right at the edge of the hallway, standing perfectly still in the shadow of the doorway. Melissa's voice drifted through the open archway, crisp and impatient. Once he signs, we can handle the house before the next mortgage payment. I waited, holding my breath, hoping my son would defend me, hoping he would tell his wife that my home was not their personal rescue fund, and that my life was not an obstacle to be cleared away. Eric sighed, a heavy, tired sound that carried straight down the hall. He will hate the place at first, but he will adjust. Those 12 words anchored themselves directly in my chest. The cold reality of the situation washed over me, erasing any lingering doubt. He was not being manipulated or pressured against his will. My son was a full, willing participant in the plan to take my home. I set the plates gently on the kitchen counter, making sure the porcelain did not clink together, and walked silently down the hall to Eleanor's old study. I closed the heavy oak door until the brass latch clicked into place. Reaching into the bottom desk drawer, I pulled out my address book and dialed the private number of Rebecca Sloan. She was the estate planning attorney who had expertly handled Eleanor's final affairs 5 years ago. When Rebecca answered, I did not waste time with small talk or emotional complaints. I gave her only the verifiable facts. I told her about the senior care facility deposit, the unsigned real estate documents Eric had brought, the scheduled move-in date, and the conversation I had just documented in my notebook with the exact time and date. I asked for her earliest confidential appointment. The line stayed quiet for a long moment while the attorney processed the timeline. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of all its usual warmth, replaced by a sharp, clinical precision. Do not sign anything, Rebecca instructed, her tone leaving no room for debate. Bring every document tomorrow. If they are moving this fast, we should assume they expect you to act slowly. The morning air felt unusually heavy when I pulled into the parking lot of Sloan & Associates. Dew still clung to the manicured hedges lining the brick building, and the distant sound of morning traffic hummed along the highway. I carried Eleanor's wooden document box under my right arm, feeling the solid weight of the polished mahogany against my ribs. Walking through the glass doors, I noticed the familiar scent of lemon polish and brewed coffee, grounding me in the reality of what I was about to do. Rebecca Sloan sat behind a massive oak desk, wearing a tailored navy suit. She had guided Eleanor and me through our estate planning years ago, and she did not waste time with empty pleasantries. I set the box on the desk, unfastened the brass clasp, and slid the contents toward her: the glossy senior care folder, the non-refundable deposit receipt, the unsigned power of attorney packet Eric had brought to my kitchen, and finally, my own handwritten log detailing the exact conversation I had overheard in the sunroom last night. The attorney reviewed each page in complete silence. The only sound in the room was the sharp rustle of premium paper turning and the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. An unsigned power of attorney is just expensive scrap paper, Harold, Rebecca finally said, tapping a manicured fingernail against Eric's real estate document. He cannot force a sale or move you anywhere with this. But the fact that they paid a non-refundable deposit means they intend to bypass your consent entirely. If you refuse to sign, their next logical step is a guardianship petition. My jaw tightened. They would try to prove I am incompetent. They would try to use your recent fall and Eleanor's passing to paint a picture of decline, the lawyer corrected, turning toward her computer monitor. Her keyboard clicked rapidly as she pulled up the county property records. Let us look at our defenses. Eleanor's estate was fully settled in 2022. You hold the sole title to the mansion. There is no mortgage, there are no liens, and there is no transfer on death deed. Legally, your property is a fortress. We just need to make sure your mind is legally classified the exact same way. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting on a crinkly paper-covered examination table in Dr. Eris's clinic. My longtime physician listened carefully as I explained the situation, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to quiet concern. I did not ask for a generic health check. I specifically requested a cognitive screening and a decision-specific capacity assessment regarding real estate and financial planning. Dr. Eris conducted the evaluations, asking detailed questions about my assets, the current date, and my understanding of property values. Once we finished, I signed a strict HIPAA authorization, directing his office to send the written assessment directly to Rebecca. My medical privacy was secure, and my cognitive competence was now a matter of documented medical record. I returned to the law office just after noon. Rebecca had prepared a small conference room for the next step. 2 paralegals I had never met sat across from me, acting as neutral witnesses. A small digital camera rested on a tripod in the corner. Staring into the lens, I stated my full name and the current date. I calmly explained that I was acting completely voluntarily, that I understood the approximate market value of my home, and that I was planning to sell it without any outside pressure or coercion. We recorded the statement in one single take. Now we address the timeline, Rebecca said, motioning for me to follow her back to her main office. A conventional real estate listing takes 30 to 60 days. You would have strangers walking through your hallways, and Eric would inevitably see a sign in the yard. Their tentative move-in date for you is less than 14 days away. We cannot afford the traditional market. She opened a fresh folder and produced a sleek brochure for a local real estate investment company. The firm specialized in purchasing high-value properties entirely in cash. They offer off-market as-is purchases, the attorney explained, pouring us both fresh glasses of water. They will waive the financing contingencies. Because your title is completely clean, they can complete the inspection and close the sale in under 2 weeks. The catch is the price. You will take an approximate 10% discount on the open market value for the speed and the secrecy. Accept the discount, I answered immediately. I am buying certainty, not maximizing profit. What about the contents of the house? Rebecca smiled a thin, strategic smile. That is the beauty of an as-is cash sale. You do not have to empty a 10,000 square foot mansion. The massive dining table, the antique beds, the patio furniture, they all stay. You hire an insured moving company to discreetly pack Eleanor's keepsakes, your personal papers, your clothing, and anything you genuinely cherish. The buyer absorbs the rest. A profound sense of relief washed over my bruised hip. I would not have to break my back packing decades of memories into cardboard boxes. I could simply walk away. There is one final piece, I told her, leaning forward. The money. Eric and Melissa are drowning in credit card debt and missed car payments. If I hold the proceeds in my personal accounts, they will never stop hounding me for a bailout. I want to build a wall they can never climb. I directed Rebecca to draft an irrevocable education trust, naming my grandchildren, Ethan and Olivia, as the sole beneficiaries. We selected an independent corporate trustee to manage the funds. The terms were absolute. The trustee would pay qualified tuition, books, approved housing, and vocational training costs directly to the accredited institutions or vendors. My son and daughter-in-law would have zero withdrawal authority. They would not be able to touch a single cent. We spent the next 2 hours finalizing the structure of the trust, ensuring every legal door Eric might try to pry open was bolted shut from the inside. Just as the wall clock struck 3, Rebecca's desk phone chimed softly. She answered it, listened for a brief moment, and asked the receptionist to print the incoming email. A few minutes later, the attorney placed a freshly printed cash offer contract right in the center of the desk. The numbers were exact. The terms were flawless. Rebecca looked across the desk, her eyes completely serious. If you accept this, the house can legally belong to someone else before their scheduled move-in date for you. I picked up the heavy brass pen resting on Rebecca Sloane's desk and stared at the cash offer contract. The document promised a 14-day closing period, waiving all financing contingencies and accepting the property exactly as it stood. I checked the addendum at the back, confirming the buyer had agreed to my one specific demand. They would grant me a 24-hour occupancy period after the deed was recorded, and their closing agent would personally deliver a sealed wooden document box to my son. My signature went on the dotted line. The ink dried in seconds, setting a clock in motion that Eric and Melissa could not see. The buyer scheduled their inspection for a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the work week when my son and daughter-in-law were safely at their respective offices. No real estate signs appeared on the pristine front lawn, and no photographs were uploaded to public listing websites. A quiet man in a gray polo shirt walked through the rooms, testing light switches and checking the water pressure. Because we had agreed to an off-market, as-is transaction, I did not have to lift a single piece of heavy furniture or negotiate over scuffed baseboards. The massive dining table, the patio sets, and the antique guest beds would all transfer to the new owner. I hired a fully insured moving company to handle the items that actually mattered. 2 professionals arrived in an unmarked truck, carefully packing Eleanor's personal letters, our family photo albums, my clothing, and a small cedar chest she had cherished. Everything else stayed exactly where it was. While the title company worked through the background paperwork, I took a taxi to a large dealership on the other side of Columbus. Walking past rows of massive luxury coaches, I found a reliable, pre-owned Class C motorhome. It was exactly the kind of vehicle Eleanor had always pointed out on our highway trips, the one she had dreamed of owning before her illness grounded us. I paid for the RV using a cashier's check drawn directly from my liquid savings account, leaving the pending house sale proceeds completely untouched to avoid any timing contradictions. Driving the motorhome back toward the suburbs, a strange sense of momentum settled in my chest. I parked it at a secure overnight storage lot, then requested a ride to the cemetery. The autumn air felt crisp as I walked across the manicured grass toward Eleanor's headstone. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rustling through the oak trees. Reaching into my jacket pocket, I pulled out the old road atlas she had marked up with yellow highlighter years ago. Hidden inside the pages was a sealed letter she had written during her final months. I had never possessed the courage to open that envelope. "I am finally taking the trip," I whispered to the cold granite stone. "Just like we promised." I placed my hand on the top edge of the marker, feeling the rough texture of the carved letters, and silently promised her that I would not let anyone turn the home we built into a shortcut for their own greed. The morning of the closing arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the suburban streets clean. Sitting in a quiet glass-walled room at the title company, I signed the final deed, transferring ownership of the mansion. The buyer immediately wired the agreed purchase price into the escrow account. After the closing costs, property taxes, legal fees, and a modest cushion for my travel expenses were subtracted, the vast majority of the funds moved instantly. The money dropped straight into an irrevocable education trust set up strictly for Ethan and Olivia. The independent corporate trustee officially took control of the capital, mandated to pay only for qualified tuition, approved housing, or vocational training directly to the institutions. Eric and Melissa had absolutely no withdrawal authority. The wealth they had banked their entire financial survival on was now locked behind a legal vault they could never open. The county officially recorded the new deed the very next morning, exactly 1 day before the tentative move-in date my son had scheduled for me at the nursing facility. My 24-hour occupancy period was ticking down. The house echoed differently now, stripped of its soul despite the furniture remaining exactly in place. I walked into the dining room and placed Eleanor's wooden document box right in the center of the table. Inside were copies of the nursing home reservation, the unexecuted power of attorney, the trust certificate, and a letter I had written to my son. The buyer's agent would find it there and hand-deliver it to Eric later that afternoon. I left the heavy brass house keys resting on top of the smooth wooden lid. Turning off the lights one by one, I stepped out the front door and pulled it shut. The deadbolt clicked with a sharp, final metallic snap. I climbed into the driver's seat of the RV well before sunrise, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without checking the rearview mirror. The sky began to turn a bruised shade of purple as I crossed the county line, merging onto the westbound interstate. Morning light eventually spilled through the wide windshield, casting long shadows across the highway, and for the first time in 8 days, the dull ache in my bruised hip had faded into a manageable throb. I kept both hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the Ohio suburbs slowly give way to open farmland. Suddenly, the bright screen of my cell phone lit up in the cup holder, illuminating the dark plastic console. The caller identification flashed with Eric's name. Ignoring the incoming call, I let the system route it directly to voicemail. A minute later, a small notification tone chimed through the cabin speakers. I pressed the audio icon on the dashboard display, letting my son's recorded message fill the quiet space. "Dad, where are you?" Eric asked, his voice laced with genuine confusion rather than anger. A notice just came in the mail from a title company. It says the county recorded a new owner for the house, and they sent a copy to me because I am listed as your emergency contact. Call me back right now. This has to be some kind of clerical mistake. A clerical mistake. I reached out and tapped the screen to archive the message, keeping my speed steady at 65 miles per hour. He still believed he was in complete control of the timeline. 2 hours later, I pulled into a quiet highway rest stop near the Indiana border to stretch my legs and brew a fresh pot of coffee in the small galley kitchen. While the water bubbled in the percolator, my phone buzzed with an encrypted email notification from Rebecca Sloan. The message was brief and strictly professional. The buyer's closing agent had successfully completed the property transfer, and per our contractual agreement, the sealed wooden box had been handed directly to my son at his office. Eric now possessed physical copies of his own nursing home reservation packet, the unexecuted power of attorney cover page, the irrevocable trust certificate, and the single letter I had written to explain my departure. I poured the hot coffee into a ceramic mug, inhaling the rich, dark scent of the roast, and sat down at the small dinette table. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable reaction. The phone rang again. This time, the digital transcription popped up on the screen before I even touched the audio playback. When I finally pressed the button, the confusion in my son's voice had completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, rising panic. "What did you do?" Eric demanded, his breath hitching over the small speaker. "You sold the house? Without talking to us? Where are the proceeds, Dad?" "You cannot just liquidate a family asset and disappear. You are not thinking clearly." Family asset. He could not bring himself to call it my home, even now. I saved the audio file to a secure folder and took a slow sip of my drink, letting the dark liquid warm my throat. Almost immediately, a rapid series of text messages began appearing on my screen, vibrating against the laminate tabletop. Melissa had clearly taken over the communication strategy. The first message arrived in all capital letters. "We are calling a lawyer." A second message followed less than 30 seconds later. "You are clearly confused after your fall, and we will challenge this illegal sale in court." Then came the emotional strike. The exact wording she probably assumed would break my resolve and bring me rushing back to the suburbs. "You have completely destroyed the children's future." Locking the phone screen, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over my shoulders. Her manipulation was entirely hollow because the trust Rebecca and I had built specifically protected Ethan and Olivia. My daughter-in-law was not grieving for her children's educational opportunities. She was mourning the sudden loss of the rescue fund she had already spent in her own mind. Later that afternoon, as the motorhome crossed into Illinois, Rebecca called me directly through the hands-free system. Her tone was crisp and completely devoid of any concern over Melissa's legal threats. "Eric just called my office," the attorney reported, the faint clatter of a keyboard echoing in the background. "He demanded to know where the escrow funds were deposited. With your prior permission, I informed him that the sale was entirely valid, your medical capacity was thoroughly documented prior to closing, and no family member possesses any legal authority over the proceeds." "How did he handle that information?" I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the open road. "He threatened to file a guardianship petition," Rebecca replied smoothly. "I reminded him that an independent corporate trustee now controls the assets, meaning a guardianship would give him exactly zero access to the money." He hung up the phone. Pulling into a quiet overnight RV park just before dusk, I connected my laptop to the secure wireless network and opened the final electronic package from the trust company. The digital document loaded slowly, revealing the bold heading of the Bennett Educational Trust. Scrolling down the page, I saw Ethan and Olivia listed as the sole beneficiaries, followed by the exact funded amount safely locked inside the account. The money was not gone. It had simply been rerouted past the grasping hands of their parents, preserved exclusively for tuition, books, and approved vocational training. My cell phone vibrated against the table one last time. Another voicemail had slipped through the filters. I pressed play, expecting another wave of Melissa's empty threats. But Eric's voice filled the small camper instead. He sounded entirely different now. The practiced corporate anger had drained away, leaving nothing but an echoing, hollow disbelief. "I drove over there," my son whispered, his voice trembling slightly against the microphone. "I went there this morning to check the doors. The lockbox was gone. A closing agent met me in the driveway. Dad, the mansion is gone." Leaning back against the vinyl dinette cushions, I stared out the window at the brilliant orange and purple sunset. Eric had actually gone back to the property, likely expecting to find me sitting in my armchair, waiting to be scolded and steered into a senior care facility. Instead, he found a stranger holding a legal deed. Before I could close the phone application, a new text message arrived from Melissa. The words on the glowing screen proved that their financial reality was finally crashing down around them. "Call us before the bank takes the car." Their crisis was no longer a theoretical problem waiting to be solved by my inheritance. It had finally arrived, built entirely by their own hands. The rain had finally stopped by the time I woke up the next morning, leaving the air outside the motorhome smelling sharply of wet pine needles and damp earth. I sat at the small dinette table with a cup of black coffee, watching the early light filter through the trees at the edge of the campground. My cell phone sat right next to my mug, completely silent for the past 8 hours. The frantic barrage of messages from the previous night had ceased, replaced by a single, carefully worded email from Eric requesting a formal phone conversation. I replied and agreed to a call at 9 o'clock, with one specific condition: Rebecca Sloan would be on the line. When the time arrived, I placed the phone in the center of the table and activated the speaker. Rebecca joined the conference bridge a moment later, offering a brief professional greeting. Another heavy silence stretched across the connection before my son finally unmuted his microphone. "Dad," Eric started, his voice thick with a forced, trembling earnestness. "This has all gone entirely out of proportion. We were just terrified you would fall again. Melissa and I were only trying to protect you, and you completely overreacted." I took a slow breath, letting the familiar smell of the roasted coffee ground me. He was still trying to play the victim, still trying to wrap his entitlement in a blanket of fake concern. "You do not pay a non-refundable fee to hold a room at a senior care facility because of a bruised hip," I replied, keeping my volume perfectly level. "You do not schedule a move-in date behind my back. And you certainly do not bring over a power of attorney packet granting yourself broad authority to sell my real estate if your only worry is my physical health." "That was just standard paperwork," he insisted quickly, though the defensive edge in his tone betrayed him. "Melissa stood in my sunroom and talked about using the house to cover your next mortgage payment," I told him, closing my eyes and remembering the exact weight of that moment. I heard the entire conversation, Eric. Every word. The line went completely dead for a long time. The only sound was the faint hum of the RV refrigerator and the distant chirp of a morning bird. When my son finally spoke again, the polished corporate facade had completely shattered. "We are drowning," Eric whispered, the truth finally spilling out into the open air. "We are 3 months behind on the SUV payments. We owe roughly $87,000 in unsecured credit card debt. Melissa signed a commercial lease agreement for her boutique, and the massive deposit is due by the end of the week. If we do not pay it, we lose the location and face a breach of contract penalty." The sheer scale of their financial ruin hung in the air. They both earned decent salaries, enough to support a comfortable life, but they had chosen to build a hollow empire of luxury cars, an oversized suburban home, and business gambles they could never actually afford. "And the nursing home deposit?" I asked quietly, dreading the answer, but needing to hear him admit it. "We used the very last of our emergency savings for that," he confessed, his breath hitching audibly. "Melissa convinced me that if we secured your room first, we could handle the paperwork afterward. We thought the mansion sale would reimburse us almost immediately." A cold, heavy knot formed directly behind my ribs. The very first financial loss in their elaborate scheme was the money my son had spent trying to remove his own father from his home. He had bet his remaining safety net against my dignity, and he had lost. "I need you to reverse the trust," Eric pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. "Just a partial distribution, Dad. Enough to save the car and clear the boutique deposit. Please." I looked out the window at the morning dew dripping from the pine branches. I felt no joy in his suffering, no triumphant thrill of revenge, only a profound and exhausting sadness. "No," I answered, my voice steady and resolute. "The education trust belongs to Ethan and Olivia now. The trustee will ensure their tuition is paid and their future is protected. I will not let you drain their college funds to pay off your creditors." Eric let out a sharp, choked sound. The call disconnected a second later. 4 days passed without a single word. I drove further west, eventually pulling into a massive state park in Ohio. The deep woods offered a profound sense of isolation, a quiet contrast to the turmoil I had left behind in the suburbs. I spent my afternoons walking the hiking trails, writing in my journal, and letting the lingering ache in my hip finally heal. The consequences of their choices arrived realistically, exactly as the math dictated. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, a new voicemail appeared on my phone. I pressed play while wiping down the small kitchen counter. It was Eric. His tone was hollow, stripped of all energy and fight. The lender had arrived at their house early that morning with a tow truck. The luxury SUV had been repossessed straight out of their driveway, a direct and unavoidable result of the missed payments I had seen listed on Melissa's printed budget. An hour later, a text message arrived from Melissa. The words practically vibrated with bitter resentment. "You ruined my business before it even started. We lost the lease deposit. I hope you are happy playing the victim while your family falls apart." I read the message twice, then quietly deleted it from my screen. She was still refusing to accept accountability, still entirely convinced that my property was supposed to be her personal salvation. I set the phone face down on the table, walked out the side door of the motorhome, and set up my small folding chair under the awning. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant streaks of copper and violet. I brewed a fresh cup of tea, sat down in the cool evening air, and watched the shadows stretch across the park. The peace I felt in that moment was profound, completely untouched by the financial collapse they had engineered for themselves. Just as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, my phone buzzed lightly in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another angry message from my daughter-in-law. The notification showed a text from Ethan. My 18-year-old grandson had not contacted me since the day I left. "Grandpa, I found out about the trust. Mom says you abandoned us. Is that true?" The sun had completely disappeared behind the tree line of the Ohio State Park, leaving a cool, damp chill in the evening air. I sat in my canvas folding chair outside the motorhome, staring at the glowing screen of my cell phone. The text message from my 18-year-old grandson hung there, demanding an answer. He wanted to know if I had abandoned them, just like his mother claimed. I tapped the screen, bypassing the keyboard, and dialed his number directly. Ethan was a legal adult now, meaning he could handle the truth without any parental intermediaries and could speak to the trustee directly. The line rang twice before the connection opened. "Grandpa?" Ethan answered, his voice tight and heavy, with the kind of stress a high school senior should never have to carry. "Are you okay? Where are you right now?" "I am perfectly safe, Ethan," I said, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "I am traveling by choice. Is your sister there with you?" A brief rustling sound echoed through the speaker, followed by a quiet click. "I am here, Grandpa," Olivia said. My 16-year-old granddaughter joined with Ethan's phone on speaker. Mom has been crying all week. She told us you became confused after your fall, sold the house impulsively, and took away the money intended for the family. I closed my eyes and let the cool evening breeze wash over my face. The false version was exactly what I expected from Melissa, painting me as a confused old man while casting herself as the victim. Hearing it weaponized against my grandchildren required a different kind of restraint. I had to protect them from the misinformation without turning them into weapons against their own parents. I did not become confused, and I did not sell the house on an impulse, I explained carefully, offering a measured explanation. I found a nursing care reservation made without my consent. There were also unsigned legal papers that would have given your father broad authority over my affairs. I deliberately stopped there. I did not call their parents monsters, and I absolutely did not disclose the staggering credit card debt or the delinquent car payments. They did not need to carry the heavy burden of the adult financial ruin their parents had engineered. But what about the trust? Ethan asked, the confusion still evident in his breathing. Mom said you locked away the family money and ruined our future. I protected your future, I corrected him, making sure the trust was explained accurately. I established an irrevocable trust managed by an independent corporate trustee. When you graduate this spring, Ethan, the independent trustee, will contact you and pay your university tuition directly to the accredited college. They will also cover your textbooks and approved housing. Olivia, your funds will remain completely protected until you reach the age and conditions stated in the trust. I promised my grandson that Rebecca Sloan and the corporate trustee would send a formal beneficiary notice and a plain language summary to his email tomorrow, allowing him to verify the exact terms himself rather than blindly believing me. Olivia would receive only the information permitted for a minor beneficiary through the appropriate legal channel. There would be no secret meetings and no hidden agendas. A long, ragged sigh came through the phone. Dad told me to stop filling out those scholarship applications last month, Ethan admitted. My hand tightened around the armrest of my chair. Why would he tell you that? He said I did not need to worry about the cost of tuition anymore, my grandson replied, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. He pointed at your house and told me the mansion was already the family inheritance. He discouraged me from applying for scholarships because college would soon be fully covered. The ground beneath my boots felt suddenly unstable. Eric had not just expected my money to save him from his own debt. He had actively taught his son that my home was their guaranteed property, planting the seed of entitlement in the next generation long before the betrayal was exposed. Grandpa, Ethan asked, breaking through the sudden quiet, can I ask you the hardest question? You can ask me anything, I told him. Do you still love Dad? The question hung in the cool autumn air, raw and unguarded. I looked at the dark silhouette of the trees against the twilight sky, searching for the most honest answer I could give a young man stepping into adulthood. I do love him, I finally answered. But love does not require surrendering one's rights, Ethan. It does not mean you have to fund someone else's dishonesty. You can love your family and still walk away when they refuse to respect your basic dignity. We talked for another 10 minutes, letting the heavy tension slowly dissipate. I promised to begin mailing each grandchild postcards from my route, maintaining our relationship without using the trip as a public performance. When we finally said our goodbyes and the line disconnected, I sat alone in the dark for a very long time. The betrayal had been much deeper than a simple real estate grab or a nursing home reservation. Eric's greed had already infected his children's understanding of family and property, a quiet poison that I had caught just in time. Watching the first few stars appear above the tree canopy, I knew leaving was the only way to show them how to survive it. 2 days after my conversation with Ethan, an encrypted email from Rebecca Sloan appeared on my laptop screen. The message was brief and completely professional. Eric had formally contacted her office, requesting a direct phone conversation with me. My attorney advised against speaking to him while their financial situation was actively collapsing, but I knew leaving the silence unresolved would only drag the conflict out longer. I told Rebecca I would accept the call under one strict condition. My son had to confirm in writing that he would not ask me to reverse the property sale, and he would not request any access to the grandchildren's education trust. An hour later, a signed electronic agreement landed in my inbox. I picked up my cell phone, stepped outside the motorhome into the cool morning air, and dialed his number. I had parked the RV at a quiet campground near the edge of the Mississippi River. The water looked dark and slow-moving under the gray sky. When the line connected, I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited. "Dad," Eric started, his voice strained and rushing, sounding like a man trying to outrun a storm. You have to understand how scared we were. You fell, and you were living in that massive place all alone. Melissa and I were terrified you would get hurt again, and we just panicked. I listened to his practiced excuse, letting the silence stretch across the connection until the quiet became unbearable. He was still hiding behind a mask of concern, still refusing to admit the actual mechanics of what he had done. I opened my leather-bound notebook and smoothed the pages flat against the picnic table. Panic usually results in a phone call to a doctor, I replied, keeping my words slow and deliberate. It does not result in a non-refundable deposit at a private senior care facility. Eric tried to interrupt, but I kept speaking, letting the evidence strip away every single excuse. If this was just about my physical safety, why did the power of attorney packet include broad authority to sell my real estate? I asked, tracing my finger over my handwritten notes. Why did your wife send a text message worrying about your next mortgage payment? And why did I hear you standing in my sunroom, saying that I would hate the place at first, but I would eventually adjust? The line went completely dead for a very long time. The only sound was the distant hum of a river barge pushing against the current. My son had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, always choosing the easiest path, but he was completely trapped now. When Eric finally spoke again, his breathing was ragged and shallow. Melissa thought we could handle the paperwork afterward, he confessed, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. We never even had a doctor evaluate you for nursing care. She just told me to secure the room before the waiting list filled up, and I paid the deposit. The absolute absurdity of their arrogance hit me like a physical blow. They had not even bothered to check if I medically qualified for a care facility. They had simply treated it like booking a hotel room, assuming my grief and my age made me compliant. You expected me to just sign the financial papers without reading them, I said. Yes, my son admitted, the single word sounding like a complete defeat. We figured you trusted me. We planned to move you first, get you settled, and then persuade you that selling an empty mansion was the only practical choice left. A sharp, muffled noise suddenly rattled through the speaker, followed by a woman's voice shouting in the background. Melissa had clearly been listening to the conversation. You care more about dead memories than your own living family, my daughter-in-law screamed over the connection, her voice sharp with bitter entitlement. We are losing everything, and you are just punishing us for trying to help you. You prefer an empty house over us. She still could not see the truth. She still believed my property was a bank account that belonged to her. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice to match her rage. I simply reached forward and pressed the red button on my screen, cutting her off mid-sentence. I set the phone down on the wooden table and watched the river flow southward. 10 minutes passed. The sky above the water began to darken, and the first heavy drops of afternoon rain started to fall. My phone rang again. I picked it up and answered without speaking. This time, the background noise was entirely different. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of windshield wipers and the muffled roar of highway traffic. Eric had left the house and was calling back alone. I am sorry, my son said. No excuses followed, no justifications about his debt or his wife's pressure. I looked at your grief over Mom as a weakness, and I treated your house like money that was already owed to me. I was a coward, Dad, and I am so sorry. It was the first honest thing he had said to me in nearly a year. He was finally taking responsibility for his own fatal flaw, admitting that his cowardice and entitlement had broken our family apart. I am driving west, I told him, watching the rain streak across the surface of the river. I will be near Moab in about 4 months. If you want to talk to me face to face, you will meet me there, at a public campground, alone. We will not discuss the house sale, and we will not discuss the trust. I will be there, Eric promised instantly, his voice cracking. Dad, please tell me, can we ever actually fix this? I looked down at the dark screen of my phone, listening to the steady drum of the rain against the metal roof of the motorhome. I loved my son, but love did not mean erasing the consequences of his actions. I will see you in Utah, I replied, and hung up the phone without giving him the absolute reassurance he wanted. Late summer heat radiated from the towering red sandstone cliffs outside Moab, Utah. 4 months had passed since I drove away from the Ohio suburbs, and the drive had taken me through the endless green cornfields of Indiana, across the flat plains of Missouri and Kansas, and over the high mountain passes of Colorado. I traveled at a slow, deliberate pace, letting the vast open spaces of the country put distance between me and the betrayal I left behind. A faded silver sedan crunched along the gravel road of the public campground, breaking the quiet afternoon silence. The car pulled into the empty visitor space near my motorhome, the engine sputtering slightly before shutting off. My son stepped out into the dry dust. Eric looked visibly older, his shoulders slumped beneath a wrinkled cotton shirt. The pristine luxury vehicle he once drove had clearly been surrendered to the bank, replaced by whatever affordable transportation he could secure after his credit collapsed. He had come alone, exactly as we agreed. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Eric said, his voice lacking the polished corporate confidence he used to wear like armor. He took a seat at the weathered wooden picnic table, keeping his hands folded neatly in his lap. "You drove a long way," I replied, setting 2 glass bottles of cold water on the wooden planks between us. He stared at the condensation forming on the glass, refusing to meet my eyes. "Melissa first suggested the senior care idea," he began, the words rushing out as if he needed to expel them, but I went along with it. "I paid the reservation fee with our own money. I requested the legal paperwork from the attorney, and I actively chose not to ask you what you wanted." The dry desert wind swept across the campsite, rattling the canvas awning above our heads. I remained completely silent, letting him carry the full weight of his own confession. My son unclasped his hands and pressed them flat against the table. My cowardice made the entire betrayal possible. I was terrified of confronting our debt, so I looked for the easiest target. A bitter, hollow laugh caught in his throat. "And there is something else you should know. A final detail about that plan." I took a slow sip of water, waiting for the rest of the truth. "That non-refundable deposit I paid to the facility," Eric continued, shaking his head. "They kept every single cent when you never showed up for the scheduled move-in date. The very first piece of our financial collapse was the money I spent trying to get rid of my own father." The brutal irony of his admission hung in the warm air. He had bet his remaining safety net on a plan to erase my independence, and he had lost everything in the process. I looked at the thick layer of red dust coating his cheap leather shoes. "The money was never the deepest wound, Eric," I told him, making sure my voice carried clearly over the wind. "The true pain came from watching you convert me from a father into an obstacle. You looked at the home Eleanor and I built, a place filled with our entire shared history, and you only saw collateral to cover your own mistakes." Eric wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his face pale despite the intense Utah sun. "Is there any way the trust could help with the remaining family debt?" he asked, the desperation finally bleeding through his remorse. "Just a small percentage to keep us from completely drowning?" "No," I answered immediately. The single word hung absolute and immovable between us. "The independent trustee handles qualified educational distributions for Ethan and Olivia. That is a permanent wall. I will not let you drain your children's future to pay off your creditors. Forgiveness will never become a financial transaction." He closed his eyes and nodded slowly, accepting the reality he could no longer manipulate. "I do not want to carry this rage anymore," I explained, watching a hawk circle high above the canyon rim. "I can forgive you, but trust has to be rebuilt through actual behavior over years, not hours. And your wife is not welcome to contact me until she can acknowledge what she did without trying to blame me for her own choices." We sat together for another 20 minutes, drinking the cold water while the sun began to dip behind the massive rock formations. We did not share a false, tearful embrace. I offered no promises about moving back east, and he asked for no further favors. Eric stood up from the picnic table and walked over to the rusted sedan. He opened the heavy metal door, pausing for a moment before getting inside. Looking back across the gravel parking pad, he offered a small, resigned nod. "I understand why you left," he said quietly. The old car started with a rough cough, and I watched the taillights disappear down the winding desert road. Night fell quickly over the canyon, bringing a sharp, biting chill to the air. I went inside the quiet motorhome and sat alone at the small dinette table. The profound isolation of the desert pressed against the fiberglass walls, but for the first time in 10 months, my chest felt completely clear. Reaching into my canvas travel bag, I pulled out Eleanor's old road atlas. The yellow highlighted pages felt brittle and fragile under my fingers as I opened the cover. Hidden right in the center fold was the sealed white envelope my wife had written during her final year. I had carried it across the country, keeping it safely tucked away since the day I visited her grave. But tonight, the time for waiting had finally passed. I slid my thumb under the paper flap and broke the seal on the envelope I had carried for months. The heavy parchment felt stiff and dry as I unfolded the brief letter Eleanor had written during her final year, which had been tucked carefully inside her marked road atlas. Her sweeping cursive script filled the small page, the blue ink still bright after all this time. Seeing her handwriting again made the air catch tight in my throat. She wrote to tell me that if she died first, I must not turn our home into a prison. She demanded that I not mistake staying still for loyalty, urging me to keep moving forward. I read the words 3 times, letting the letters blur slightly as my vision gathered water. She had known my stubborn heart perfectly, and she had provided the exact permission I needed to finally let go. The fierce summer heat of Utah slowly gave way to the crisp, cooling winds of early autumn as I steered the motorhome further south. Reaching the south rim of the Grand Canyon took another week of steady, quiet driving. I woke up well before dawn on a Tuesday morning, bundled in a thick wool sweater against the biting chill, and walked out to a safe overlook. The vast void of the canyon stretched out in total darkness, an ocean of shadows waiting for the dawn. Then the sun breached the eastern horizon, spilling a brilliant, blinding wash of gold and crimson across the ancient stone layers. I placed Eleanor's framed photograph right beside the old road atlas on a flat, weathered rock and watched the sunrise. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since her funeral finally fractured and scattered into the morning wind. We had finally made it. The seasons continued to turn, bringing the bright thaw of spring to the desert. Months after my abrupt departure from Ohio, a secure email from Rebecca Sloan arrived in my inbox, containing a formal notification from the corporate trustee. Ethan had officially graduated from high school and successfully enrolled in an accredited engineering program. The attached document confirmed that the trustee had paid his first tuition installment directly to the university bursar. My grandson was completely protected, his education fully funded without his parents ever touching the account routing numbers. Olivia was still a teenager in high school, so her specific funds remained securely locked away, fully protected until she reached the eligible age to attend college. Later that same week, a long message from my son appeared on my phone screen. Eric and I were slowly figuring out a new reality, and he had begun sending me a monthly message without ever asking for rescue money. I answered him occasionally, keeping our contact brief but entirely honest. This particular update laid out the final, brutal mathematics of their situation. Without my house to cover their massive unsecured debt, Eric and Melissa had been forced to sell their oversized suburban house. They packed up whatever furniture would fit into a moving truck and moved into a much smaller rental property. The luxury boutique venture was completely dead, the business never opening its doors because they lost the commercial lease. They were currently enrolled in a strict, structured debt repayment plan that would siphon away their disposable income for years to come. No police officers arrived at their door with warrants, and nobody was arrested because their scheme had ultimately failed before any illegal transfer could occur. The financial ruin they designed for me simply collapsed on their own heads, leaving them exactly where their choices led them. Melissa, however, remained exactly the same. Shortly after Eric sent his humbling update, a single text message from my daughter-in-law pushed through my filtered notifications. She claimed I had completely overreacted to the situation, typing out a long paragraph about their so-called good intentions while entirely ignoring the physical evidence of their deceit. I did not type out a reply, nor did I feel any lingering anger. I simply deleted the text and set the phone face down on the laminate table. Her absolute inability to accept fault for her own actions had become her lasting personal defeat. Sitting in the driver's seat of the RV, I poured a fresh cup of coffee and looked out through the wide windshield at the sprawling landscape. Our relationship was not magically restored to what it once was before the betrayal, but it was no longer built on a fragile foundation of pretending. Taking a slow sip of the dark roast, I finally understood that selling the mansion did not erase Eleanor, nor did it destroy our family. It simply prevented greed from rewriting our life's work. The massive brick and stone house was never the actual inheritance Eric believed it was. He had treated the property like a birthright, a golden ticket out of his own irresponsibility. The true inheritance I gave my family was the quiet, absolute example of how a person protects their dignity without becoming cruel, and my son had almost lost even that. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy engine roared to life with a comforting, steady rumble. The bright morning light caught the silver edge of the picture frame resting securely beside the road atlas on the passenger seat. I shifted the transmission into gear, stepped firmly on the accelerator, and drove the motorhome westward into the morning light. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the open road stretching out ahead, and I did not look back. When you listen to Harold drive away in his motorhome, leaving the empty mansion behind, it is incredibly easy to focus solely on the satisfaction of his secret sale. The flawless execution of the irrevocable trust and the quiet escape make for a perfect victory. But the real weight of this story rests on a foundation much more common than a stolen $1 million estate. It rests on the quiet, dangerous way families frequently confuse love with control. As the people who raised you grow older, the natural dynamics of care begin to shift. You might find yourself stepping in to help with complicated medical appointments, scheduling household repairs, or reviewing their financial planning. That transition is completely natural, but the line between supporting someone and entirely stripping away their personal autonomy is incredibly thin. When you stop asking an aging parent what they actually want, and you start deciding what is practical for them without their direct input, you are no longer protecting them. You are managing them. Eric did not begin his betrayal with pure, calculated malice. He began it with a convenient, selfish assumption that his father's deep grief and a minor physical stumble meant his mind was also failing. That assumption is a devastating trap many families fall into every single day. Age does not erase a person's fundamental right to their own agency. A bruised hip does not invalidate a lifetime of built wisdom. More importantly, a parent's home remains their sanctuary. It is never an emergency fund waiting in the wings to rescue the next generation from their own reckless spending habits. True respect means honoring the boundaries of the people who gave you life. You must remember that an inheritance is always a privilege and never a guaranteed right. Banking your own financial survival on the eventual passing or the forced relocation of a parent is a toxic entitlement that will poison even the strongest familial bonds. If you are drowning in unsecured debt or facing the collapse of your own lifestyle choices, you have to face those consequences yourself. You cannot look for a convenient shortcut through the assets your parents spent 4 decades building from the ground up. Harold showed us that holding on to your dignity sometimes requires letting go of the people who refuse to respect your basic rights. Forgiveness is a profound and necessary step for your own healing. But as this story proved, forgiving someone does not mean you have to hand them the keys to your bank accounts. You can deeply love your family from a safe distance, and you can protect your hard-earned peace by absolutely refusing to negotiate your own self-worth. The hardest part of growing older is not the physical change in the mirror. It is the terrifying fear of becoming invisible and voiceless to the people you love the most. Every senior deserves the right to hold the pen and write their own final chapters. When you look at the aging members of your own family, how do you make sure their voices are still genuinely heard and respected? Have you ever had to step up and set a harsh boundary to protect your own independence from the people who were supposed to care for you the most? Tell us your story in the comments below, because these are the exact conversations we need to share before the choices are taken out of our hands.